In the gospel last week, if you'll remember, Jesus told a parable, much like the one he told today, where he compares and contrasts different servants and the way that they respond to the gifts that they're given. Last week we had the parable of the wise virgins and the foolish virgins, right? The wise virgins being the one who had oil in their lamps prepared and were ready to welcome the bridegroom, right? And the foolish virgins who were not prepared. And this week we see these three servants, the two that invested this money, this gift that the master had given them, and then the one that went and buried it in the ground. A talent, the denomination of money that is given by the master to these servants, is about 20 years' worth of wages for a servant as these three servants. So this master has entrusted them with a tremendous amount of money, right? Something tremendously valuable. Right? And he asks that they use that, right, for basically his glory. Right? He asks that they use that to trade and to gain more and more and more, right? So that on the master's return, he can receive it back. I think the real parable here is not necessarily in the fact that there were the faithful servants who invested the money and the unfaithful servant who buried it in the ground. Right? Certainly that's on the surface an important lesson, right? We're to use the gifts that God has given us. We're to use them for his glory. But I think that the real lesson of this parable is more in the motivation of the servants. These first two servants, we would guess, right, want to trade with these talents, want to invest these things and go and trade with them so that when the master returns, they can give him this great gift back. In other words, out of love for the master and out of a desire for his good, they go and they trade and they gain more and more and more. And when the master returns, they can present him with this response. Right? The other one, the unfaithful servant, we are told explicitly what his motivation is for doing nothing. Master, I knew you were a demanding person, harvesting where you did not plant and gathering where you did not scatter. So out of fear, I went off and buried your talent in the ground. Here it is back. Out of fear, this servant was kind of crippled by his fear of the master and did nothing. And in doing nothing, he wasn't able to kind of glorify his master. Right? And we can see the parallels in our own lives, right? We can see the parallels in our own spiritual lives and our Christian life. In my relatively short time as a priest, I've worked with a lot of young people in schools and youth groups and high schools, things like that. And one of the most common questions that I hear, both from young people and even from some older people, is, Father, is X or Y or Z a sin? If I do this thing, will I go to hell? If I do this, will I be in a state of mortal sin? And in a certain sense, those are good questions to ask. Those are good things to know, right? We should want to avoid sin, and we should want to live in a state of grace. But it seems to me that the motivation behind that is a fear. I need to know how close I can get to the edge without falling off, right? I think for many of us, this is kind of a default view of the Christian moral life. Right? To be a moral person, to be a saint, perhaps even, to be holy, simply means to avoid sin. Simply means to not cross the boundary, right? To not go out of bounds. Right? But the reality that Jesus is trying to communicate, I think, in this parable, right, is that to be holy, to be a saint, is about much more than just merely avoiding sin. To be holy is about glorifying God with everything that we do. Not just avoiding not glorifying Him, but actively seeking to glorify God. Actively seeking out of love for the Lord to glorify Him, to work for His good. But so often we are crippled by our fear. And the fear of falling into sin keeps us from acting for the glory of God. The fear of doing something wrong keeps us from doing the good things, keeps us from acting for the good. St. John, in his first letter, says that there is no fear in love. If we want to love, if we want to truly give ourselves to the Lord and give ourselves to other people, we cannot fear. We must have the courage when we're met with obstacles to push through them, to give ourselves over to the glory of God, trusting that He's going to be there to catch us if we fall and to bring us up closer and closer to Him. Right after St. John says there is no fear in love, he then qualifies it. And he says, but perfect love casts out all fear. Perfect love casts out all fear. The beautiful thing is that Jesus defines for us what perfect love is in the Gospels. He says there is no greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Jesus gave Himself to us and for us in the act of perfect love that was His crucifixion. And here, when we come to Mass, when we celebrate this sacrament, when we participate in this Eucharistic celebration, we are drawn into a participation in His act of perfect love. So if we want to overcome our fear of falling into sin and move towards courage in love to act for the glory of God, what better place to be than here, participating in this act of perfect love that casts out all of our fear from our hearts. Today, as we come to the Eucharist and as we receive Jesus into our hearts and into our bodies, we ask for that grace, that His perfect love would cast out all the fears in our hearts that keep us from living for the glory of God, so that we can faithfully invest the gifts that the Lord has given us, these tremendously valuable gifts, His grace, His life, Himself, that we can enter into those things and we can allow those things to work in us and through us more and more for the glory of God.